Limit is t goes to -1 of t minus 1 plus the square root of 3 minus t over t squared plus 6t plus 5. The first thing we're going to do is try plugging a -1 in for each of the t's. -1 minus 1 plus the square root of 3 minus a -1 divided by -1 squared plus 6 times a -1 plus a 5. In the numerator, that will give us -1 minus 1, which is a -2, plus the square root of 3 minus a -1, which is +1, divided by -1 squared, which is 1, plus 6 times a -1, which is a -6, plus a 5. -2 plus the square root of 3 plus 1, which is a 4, divided by 1 minus 6 is a -5, plus a 5. -2 plus the square root of 4, which is a +2, over -5 plus 5. -2 plus 2 is a 0. -5 plus 5 is a 0. So we have the 0 over 0 indeterminate form. We will need to rework this. Since we have a root combination, a root involving the variable t in some way, added or subtracted together with at least one other term, we're going to try the root conjugate method. So I'm going to rewrite this limit exactly as we see it. Sometimes helps to put parentheses around the terms that are not under the root if you have more than one of them. I'm going to multiply by the root conjugate. The root conjugate is the same expression but opposite sign between the root and the collection of other terms. That's why putting a parenthesis around it will help out. I'm going to put this root conjugate over itself, a form of 1, so that when we multiply by a 1, and that's our next step, is to multiply these out. In the numerator, we have a root conjugate pair, so we will FOIL those out. First, t minus 1 times a t minus 1 will be a t minus 1 squared. Outside will be a t minus 1 times a negative root, so that'll be a negative t minus 1 times the root of 3 minus t. Inside will be a positive root times the t minus 1, so positive t minus 1 times the root of 3 minus t. And then last will be the positive root of 3 minus t times the negative root of 3 minus t. Overall, that'll give us a negative of 3 minus t. Be sure to put the 3 minus t in parentheses. We will need to distribute the negative. The outside and inside terms are equal value opposite sign always for a root conjugate FOILing. We'll cancel those out. In the denominator, we do not have a root conjugate pair, so we will not FOIL that out. We're going to keep that factored as you see it. In the numerator, we have two things we need to do. First of all, we need to FOIL out that t minus 1, and then second of all, we need to distribute that minus sign into those two terms. So we're going to take care of that in our next step. So we can rewrite this into t minus 1 and t minus 1 to help with the FOILing. So I'll rewrite everything in the denominator exactly as we see it. Okay, now let's FOIL out in the numerator. So we have the limit as t goes to 1 of t squared minus t minus another t, so minus 2t, and then plus 1. And then distribute the minus sign. We'll have a minus 3, and we'll have a plus t. That'll be divided by this entire denominator, t squared plus 6t plus 5 times t minus 1 minus the square root of 3 minus a t. We can combine like terms in the numerator. We have a t term here and here, and we have a constant here and here, and we'll be able to combine those with each other. So we will have limit as t goes to -1 of t squared minus 2t plus 1t will be minus t, and then plus 1 minus 3 will be -2. And all of that divided by t squared plus 6t plus 5 multiplied with t minus 1 minus the square root of 3 minus t. So we have multiplied by the root conjugate and simplified it. We have not eliminated the 0 over 0 indeterminate form just yet. That's going to be our next step, is to eliminate that 0 over 0 indeterminate form. We have a 0 happening in the numerator because of the expression in the numerator, and the denominator is because of that expression. And both of those are trinomial quadratics. And will not cancel just yet, but will after we factor. So I'm going to factor the numerator. That will factor into a t, a t. We need two numbers to add to a -1 and multiply to a -2. It sounds like -2 and +1 will take care of that. In the denominator, I will trinomial factor. I need two numbers to add to a +6 and multiply to be a +5. That sounds like a +5 and a +1. And I will rewrite the remaining expression exactly as we see it. Since t is going to -1, I expect a t plus 1 factor in both the numerator and denominator that was making the 0 over 0 in the first place. And there they are, and they do cancel. We have to cancel those out. And our next step becomes just rewriting what's left. And at this point, we will be able to plug in the -1 for each of the t's. The parentheses around the t minus 1 isn't really necessary any longer. I'm just going to remove them. So now we're going to plug in a -1 for each of the t's. -1 minus 2 over -1 plus 5 times -1 minus 1 minus the root of 3 minus the -1. In the numerator, -1 minus 2 is a -3. In the denominator, -1 plus 5 is a 4. -1 minus 1 is a -2, minus the square root of 3 minus a -1, which is 3 plus 1, which will be a 4. So we will have a -3 divided by a 4 times a -2 minus the square root of 4, which is a 2. So we have a -3 over 4 times minus 2 is a -4. And 4 times a -4 is a -16. The negatives can cancel out, leaving us with 3 over 16.